Welcome back, everyone. This is David Patrick Harry with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today I want to speak to you guys about logos, fractals, and sacred geometry. How do they connect? How do they relate? And how are they rooted within the logos? So that's where we're going to be getting at today, and this video sort of picks up upon a previous video I did 2 videos ago, the last video of 2019, Synchronicity and Divine Providence, and how it relates is again the concept of order, and that's going to be a central theme in this video certainly. But in regards to synchronicity or synchronistic events or God's providence, divine providence, it's certainly related to order as well. A synchronistic event is sort of a perfect ordering of meaning, of symbolism, in which you, the perceiver, is connecting a meaningful connection between various events that are occurring simultaneously. Now, that also relates certainly to divine providence, providence in regards to history, providence in regards to individual lives and their teleology, their purpose, their God-given purpose, their vocation is the usual theological term used. So that is all related to order. And today we're going to be tackling this idea of divine order again, but through a different angle, through mathematics, through sacred geometry, talking about architecture, and then ending in a longer conversation in terms of why geometry is sacred, why we call it sacred geometry, and how this all relates to logos. So that's what we're going to be getting in today. And first, what I wanted to start with was discussing fractals and natural fractals. So many of you are already going to be familiar with fractals, Mandelbrot Sets, stuff like this. And I will be covering, here in just a second, I'm going to be highlighting Benoit Mandelbrot and showing you figures of a Mandelbrot set, and this video is going to have a lot of images accompanying it because of the usefulness of a sort of visualization along with whatever I'm talking about. But some of the natural fractals that we find, and this eventually these ideas led to the creation of computer models and digital fractals and stuff like that. But natural fractals, we find them in animal coloration and various patterns within nature, animal patterns on skin, on shells, on just various things in nature. We find them in animal coloration. We find them in blood and pulmonary vessels and how that relates to river systems. We find it in coastlines. For example, there's a really interesting model you can look up of a 3D Mandelbrot. So you guys are probably familiar with what a Mandelbrot set looks like. And then finding islands that ironically, I guess potentially ironically or obviously, they look very, very similar to a Mandelbrot set itself. I mean, these are just islands that exist on the planet and how they look very similar to Mandelbrot sets. So that's coastlines. We find fractals in craters. We find fractals in trees and in the branching of trees. In fact, if you just put in fractal tree, you're going to see a whole geometric shape of triangles and stuff like that. And essentially, it's just a continual branching. But you can Google that. We find fractals in crystals, just the crystalline structure of basically anything. A frozen water molecule crystallizes into a particular way, and it creates a fractal pattern. This is true with snowflakes as well. Snowflakes are fractal. DNA is fractal. Heart rates are fractal. Mountain ranges. Lightning bolts. So if you look up like lightning discharges in like acrylic, where it kind of freezes the lightning bolt, you can see again this discharge of electricity that looks exactly like, if you put in a fractal tree or something like that, it almost looks just like that. So lightning bolts itself are fractal. Ocean waves, I already mentioned river networks. Forest canopies are fractal. And of course, Brownian motion. So Brownian motion is just the random movement of particles. And when you begin to trace individual particles through their random movement, you see that they start to form fractal patterns. So these are just a handful of natural occurring fractals in the world. And now I'm moving into mathematics, and we have what's called Mandelbrot sets, again created by Benoit Mandelbrot. And these are probably the most famous of fractals, right? And Arthur C. Clarke, there's really an interesting documentary online. You can find it on YouTube about fractals with Arthur C. Clarke, and he even describes fractals as the thumbprint of God. Thumbprint of God. So this starts to move into where I'm getting at today in regards to fractals and how they are understood. So fractals are a subset of basically complex dynamics, which is a field within mathematics. And so you get Mandelbrot sets, you get Julius sets, which are very similar. And one of the things that I wanted to highlight regarding this is how two elements of fractal mathematics. The first one is how they are really one of the first discoveries that approach an understanding of infinity. I mean, I'm not wording that right. I don't want to say understanding infinity, but you get what I'm trying to hint at with how the self-similarity at scale, at infinite scale, of a fractal mathematical pattern or a Julius set is a sort of actual model of infinity, right? And then through computer, we can just continually zoom at an infinite level and see the same pattern repeating at scale. So that right there I thought is really interesting, because the whole thing that I want to do is talk about order and God and logos, and how fractals themselves are patterns that are mathematical patterns that allow us to model infinity. And so obviously what would be a synonym with infinity other than God, logos. So the other dimension of fractals that I wanted to highlight is the chaos bounded by order. And you see this within a Julius set, which is sort of random construction. You see it in the Brownian motion. Brownian motion, again, random movement of particles. And somehow chaos itself is bounded within order. And this is something that we don't normally talk about. We think of order and chaos being these kind of antagonistic forces like good and evil. I mean, not necessarily, but you understand what I'm trying to say in this sort of dialectical thinking. But what I found most interesting in kind of doing a little bit of reading on fractals before doing this video is how really it's sort of a chaotic random structure that's surrounded, that's embedded within order, within a fractal pattern. So the pattern repeats. And I thought, wow, how does that seems so symbolic of our creation myth, of God forming order out of chaos, but God being totally transcendent to the created world that was already kind of disordered or chaotic. In regards to Genesis 1 and the creating of the world, and then how God separates the world or orders the world through language, through His Word, through the Logos. And it's the Logos then that is the mediator between God and humanity. It is Jesus Christ, the Logos, and it is the Logos that creates the created world. So I don't know, I just thought that was a really powerful idea, this idea that chaos is actually bounded by order. And so I don't do it with that what you will. I just thought that was a really interesting idea to meditate upon, to really think about, is that chaos itself in a mathematical model is actually bounded by order. So another thing that I wanted to mention was types of fractal images. So here are a few, hopefully up here or over here, there's some imagery regarding these different type of fractals. There's the Sierpinski triangle or the Sierpinski square. This is a form of fractal, a little bit different than the Mandelbrot set. There's also the fractal flame. And what I have here is from the Electric Sheep program. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Electric Sheep, but it's a program that you can install on your computer, and it's like a screensaver. But what's interesting about the Electric Sheep program is it's tied to Philip K. Dick and his novel, I believe, and that it connects, basically, if you install this program on your computer, it connects with different computers around the world, and you start to form unique screensavers, unique fractal, and so it's mostly sacred geometric fractal patterns that are moving, They're animated, and then once you install it, your computer begins to start making unique fractals. So that's called the electric sheet program, and I'm just grabbing what's called the fractal flame from that program that had been created. Then there's the Mandelbrot, which I'm sure you guys have seen in regards to, I guess, kind of spirituality, psychedelic videos, stuff like this. And this is like the more three-dimensional, 3D form of a sort of Mandelbrot set. It's called Mandelbrot. And so I'm sure you guys have seen something similar to this. And the reason why I really wanted to tackle fractals and really talk about fractals and sacred geometry in this video is because of how popular it is amongst the spiritual but not religious, the New Age, and again, this idea of the universe. Of course, we've already discussed how it's kind of idiotic to attribute God to the universe, because then you can't account for the existence of the universe itself. But they're not trying to get into deep theology and consistent levels or consistent understandings of the world, being consistent logically or anything like that. And that leads to a whole nother video I'm going to make regarding anti-rationalism and spirituality. But what I wanted to say about fractals and sacred geometry is it's used so often by the spiritual, not religious, to represent spirituality. And however, they don't have a metaphysics to account for fractals. And they are beautiful because, like I mentioned, they are infinite. They are hinting at real reality, and then it connects to all these different things like sympathetic magic. Can be, the idea of scale, simultaneous patterns at scale, can certainly start to reflect a kind of correspondential understanding of the world, sympathetic relations between things. I even made a video on maybe why does Jesus teach in parables. God, sorry, I forgot the word. Why does Jesus teach in parables? In my point. And in that video, I mentioned fractal patterns and stuff like that. But what I was trying to hint at is the sort of self-similarity at scale in terms of a parable being a narrative about, meaning, and then you're embedding that meaning in sort of a lived narrative, and then how that connects to a simile and a metaphor and, just language itself, saying something is like something else, and how Jesus is using, the Logos is using a narrative to describe larger aspects of reality. There's sort of a self-similarity there. That's what I was trying to hint at when I talked about fractal patterns or fractals or mathematics related to correspondential understandings of truth. And also in that video, this is a bit of a side note, I really did not give justice to the coherency model of truth. That will be a whole nother video as well. So, but that self-similarity at scale in regards to parables, in regards to stories, in regards to archetypes and symbolism and all this stuff, certainly corresponds to the discoveries of fractal mathematics. And I just wanted to hint at that and then lead from there, from our discussion of Mandelbrot Sets, Julia Sets, Mandelbulbs, fractal flames, stuff like this. And fractal mathematics goes into way more stuff than this. You have strange attractors, and so some of you guys who may be familiar with Terence McKenna's stuff and his kind of teleological novelty theory, and that there's an attractor at the end of time. This is tied to what was happening in the late 80s, early 90s in regards to fractals and fractal mathematics. So you can see where Terence was pulling some of these ideas. You can look at L-system fractals, the kind of shaping the development of it's more complicated than anything I could articulate, but basically development of fractal patterns, the branching off, L systems kind of describe development of trees and stuff like that. You can Google all this stuff. And then Fibonacci word fractals, that's another thing. Lots of different types of fractals, right? So now I want to move into fractal art, right? Because fractals, sacred geometry, again, in regards to the spiritual but not religious, this is huge within visionary art. And I've mentioned previously, I think this is one of the weakest points of Christian culture, generally, is how weak their art is. Whereas you look at, visionary art embedded within the kind of psychedelic, new age, spiritual, non-religious worldview, extremely colorful, extremely beautiful, rooted with meaning, even though maybe we disagree with the starting point of where they're coming from and kind of how they're understanding mathematics, sacred geometry, and all this stuff. Nonetheless, it's very beautiful and then gets people who aren't maybe as thoughtful about their worldview or their ideas into kind of that culture where in Christianity you can't really point to incredible visionary art. And I think this is one of the things that I find so attractive about icons, even though icons are still in the Byzantine style. They're very old in that regard. But we don't use fractals to represent Christianity, which we could, and that's part of this video, is to describe how we as Christians, we as specifically Orthodox Logos theology, Orthodox Christianity, has an entire metaphysics to understand sacred geometry and fractal mathematics from a spiritual theological standpoint that is entirely consistent with the tradition. And so fractal art, we see it in, like I mentioned, visionary art, but we see it in world religions generally, and we see it throughout the history of aesthetics and iconography within world religions. In the West, in the current kind of time period we find ourselves, most fractal art is digitally created, and this would be true with most of the visionary artists that I was talking about, but that's not always the case. You can hand draw this stuff, and one of the first examples that I wanted to provide for kind of fractal imagery, sacred geometry within religion, because I'm not trying to root, the goal of this video is not to say Christianity has fractals and sacred geometry in their architecture. Great, but that's true for almost all religion. Sacred geometry, understanding, fractals or using fractal ideas to understand God. The point of this video is that they don't have a strong metaphysics that is logically consistent that can account for those things, where we do in Logos theology. So the first one I wanted to show you guys, and I hope you're seeing an image right now, is of the Kandariya Mahadeva temple. And this is a medieval Indian temple. And so you can see by the sort of spires there, you can see this kind of fractal imagery, and what it looks like is sort of the Mandelbrot image that I showed you earlier. You can almost see this in this medieval architecture within India. In this particular temple, the Kandariya Mahadeva temple is actually considered one of the crown jewels of Indian architecture in the medieval period. So what's really interesting here is, again, I believe it's totally representing sacred geometry, a sort of representation of fractals, and then on closer inspection upon the temple, you see how it's replete with sort of imagery, depictions of maybe myths, symbolism, a lot of erotic symbolism. Of course, Kama Sutra comes out of Hinduism, and you see a sort of a very erotic sexual depiction on this temple. But you see, certainly, again, this understanding of sacred geometry and fractals. Now, one of the things that I started to think about looking at this temple was because I don't believe, in my opinion, and I would be happy for somebody to challenge me on this idea in providing evidence. You don't just say you disagree, but provide some evidence. I would be happy to have my perspective changed. But I don't see any strong metaphysics within Hinduism or Indian philosophy to account for these things. And so one of the things that I started to think about is the societal order versus the moral order. Because, again, on this temple, we're seeing a lot of the erotic display, a lot of sexual stuff that I would say Orthodox Christianity would be opposed to, certainly. So what we have here then is a sort of understanding of order, an understanding of mathematics and stuff like this to erect this temple. But we see from our perspective, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, a sort of violation of the moral order and a sort of celebration of potentially hedonism, something like this. And so I thought about the cultures generally, the difference between maybe an Orthodox Christian country and India is the difference between societal order and moral order. And again, I believe this relates to fractal mathematics because from the Christian perspective, you begin with the moral order, you begin with the morality of the individual, and if they start to acquiesce to the correct moral order of what we would call the logos or God, then that's going to have a ripple effect, and that's going to create a larger societal order, a larger societal harmony and unification. Whereas when you look at the caste system in India, you don't see the same emphasis on individual morality. You see it at a sort of man-made, constructed societal order. And, that's just an idea I'm playing with. It's not a very serious idea. It was just something that kind of popped in my head while I was looking at this particular cathedral or temple. So, all right, enough on that. Sorry, I was rambling. Now, the next one I wanted to show you was the mosque in in Turkey. And of course, I forget how to pronounce this. I looked it up before the video, but now I'm blanking on how to. I think it's the Selimiye Mosque. The Selimiye Mosque. That's spelled Selimiye. And this is a mosque within Turkey, and it's actually considered one of the crowning jewels of Islamic architecture. And as you're looking at this image, you can certainly see a sort of fractal, sacred geometric understanding. In Islam, as you know, they prohibit any depiction of the Prophet Muhammad and any depiction of Allah in a sort of personified form. And therefore, how do they understand Allah? What is the aesthetic use to signify God inside of a mosque? None other than sacred geometry and fractals. And you see this in this pattern. I just picked this particular mosque because of its prominence, its popularity, its significance within Islam, and its beauty. I mean, you can't disagree that it's beautiful, despite, we would have a whole disagreement theologically with the tradition of Islam, but we still recognize that sacred geometry is objectively beautiful and that this thing is objectively beautiful. And this was created by Mamar Sinan, who was described as a sort of Euclid of his time because of his understanding of geometry. So he was hired to be the architect of this mosque, and this is I believe it's 1500s when it was created, when this particular mosque. But anyways, again, we see fractals and sacred geometry. Now moving to Christianity, I just picked a couple here. You could, you could basically pick any major Catholic cathedral, Orthodox church, some of the Protestant churches, you would find sacred geometry. Unfortunately, some of the evangelical Protestant churches, they have church inside of a warehouse. They don't really focus on creating sacred space through fractals, through sacred geometry, as we find in older, more rooted historical traditions. So the first Catholic cathedral that I just picked was the Duomo di Milano. This is the Milan Cathedral. It is the largest cathedral in Italy, outside of St. Peter's Basilica, which is technically inside the Vatican City, so it's not actually part of Italy. But we see sacred geometry. I mean, just look at the front of this temple. This cathedral, and you see in the very center here. We see, if you look at the front door, then the window above it, and then the window above that, sort of towards the top, you can see a spinning circular structure. And notice how it's spinning clockwise. I found this significant because, one, it's obvious. You look at this and you kind of can see the relationship to the Hindu temple that I showed you, a similarity to the Mandelbrot fractal kind of 3D models that I showed you. But you see the stained glass, you see the sacred geometry, you see the flower of life. But then that spinning circle is moving clockwise. Why is that significant? Well, it represents the right-handed path. And whereas you take a symbol like the swastika, when it's moving clockwise like that window is, it signifies the sun. If you go to China, vegetarian food has a clockwise spinning swastika on it to symbolize the sun, and therefore this is vegetarian, grown from the sun. Whereas in Tantric Buddhism, something like the Vajrayana tradition in Tibet, you find the counterclockwise swastika. This is why Indiana Jones depicts, the movie Indiana Jones depicts the Nazis coming to Tibet. Why? Well, the tantric, the left-handed form of sort of tantrism or dark magic or anything like that was adopted by the Nazis, and that's why they use the counterclockwise swastika, along with, Tantric Buddhism. Tibetan Buddhism typically uses a counterclockwise swastika. It's a tantric form of Buddhism, and that is symbolic of the left-handed path. From our understanding, generally speaking, that is the difference between a sort of good versus evil, a sort of traditionality versus sort of inverting of the world, if you will. So I found that very interesting, that as soon as you look at this, you can see the clockwise spinning circle at the top there. Lots of beautiful, beautiful architecture here at the Milan Cathedral. And so the other one that I wanted to show you is it's a much more recent creation. In fact, it's not even complete, but it's beautiful nonetheless. Again, has a lot of fractals, has a lot of what I was trying to show you with the Mandelbrot 3D models is the Sagrada Familia Cathedral in Barcelona, Spain. It is not complete. It actually is still under construction. It's been under construction for a while, but it is so beautiful on the outside there. What you're seeing is the outside of the church, cathedral, whatever you want to say. But you can see the beautiful architecture. You can see the flowers of life and the stained glass windows, and you can see the sort of Mandelbrot structures to the architecture and the building of the spires and all this stuff. But then when you go inside and you look up, and that's what I'm showing you guys now, another sort of kind of very modern kind of fractal depiction. I mean, it's not exactly what you would typically describe as a fractal, but it's very interesting nonetheless. Certainly it's sacred geometric shapes. And then you can see from the inside the immense color in those stained glass windows, those flowers of life. You see it in the rose window there inside the picture I'm showing you. And so I could have used Notre Dame Cathedral and the rose windows. Again, sacred geometry, the flower of life, all this stuff. So, okay, now we got through all that. Why is fractals and geometry sacred? And now I'm going to begin to root it in logos theology. So one of the non-Christians that we talk about quite often is Plato. And Plato said that God geometrizes continually. God geometrizes continually. And so it was an ancient idea, whether it be Platonic solids or Euclidean geometry, that geometry is extremely important, and getting at a sort of embedded reality within nature of how whatever superpower created it, whether it be God, for whoever was describing it. Of course, we have our own understanding of who created it, but geometry itself was sacred because it was discovering these objective patterns, these objective shapes in nature that allowed us to better understand creation. And so the first thing that I wanted to highlight in sort of sacred geometry in terms of nature, we see this in like honeycombs and bees. We see it in seashells and kind of Fibonacci sequences related to the shell. We see it in pine cones. And I know pine cones is related to the whole pineal gland and the third eye and DMT and all this stuff. So we'll leave that for another video. That's a whole nother topic. But pine cones themselves have a sort of fractal, certainly a sacred geometric structure to them. And so the first thing that I wanted to talk about, and again, related to all this stuff, why is geometry sacred? It's just like I was mentioning to you how Plato says God geometrizes continually, and that geometry for a lot of these ancients was a discovery of a sort of objective structure to reality, that God's natural order that's what's being discovered through geometry, and then humanity is building in that order. And so I don't care if it's the Hindu temple or the Islamic mosque or the cathedrals. The use of sacred geometry and fractal mathematics to construct sacred space is how sacred space is created. If you had a non-symmetrical, non-harmonious, you didn't use sacred geometry or sacred or golden ratio or pi and phi or Fibonacci, you couldn't induce sacred space. Sacred space, by definition, is just, in my book, but also for other people, I'm not the only one to think this, is related to its embeddedness within sacred geometric structures, the right ratios between things, balance, right? Divine balance. That's really what it is. That's really what fractals and sacred geometry is. It's divine balance. Geometry is almost a way to think of it. Again, I've never heard anybody say this, so maybe use that are more mathematical minded would want to critique me on this, but geometry really is the science of balance, the science of shapes, the science of form, and how that relates to the world, and sort of mathematics and fractals. That a lot of it has to do with balance. And so what we're seeing then in the sort of understanding of geometry being sacred is that this is God's way, or however the Greeks thought the gods, few of them were monotheists, constructed the world, and therefore we understand these things and we use those same principles to construct sacred space. And I think that's exactly what is happening through the various uses of sacred geometry and fractal mathematics to create sacred places, is that by definition, in using those structures, you create sacred space. And then that connects from the Christian understanding of man's will and God's will, which you're not going to find necessarily in something like Hinduism. You will find that idea much more in Islam. But for us, and logos theology and understanding, logos, logoid distinctions, energy, essence distinction, that the discovery of geometry, sacred geometry, and then building structures in light of that geometry is synonymous with man's will versus God's will. God's will is those geometric structures, and it is man who is acquiescing to that structure and then building churches, cathedrals, sacred spaces using that structure. So that was the first thing I wanted to highlight. It was, okay, so why is geometry sacred? Well, it symbolizes almost mathematically and geometrically man's will versus God's will, and man discovering God's will in shapes and mathematics, and then using that understanding to create sacred space in which to recognize and worship the creator of the universe that gave us those shapes. So that was the first thing. The second thing that I wanted to talk about in regards to why is geometry sacred is the good, the true, and the beautiful, and the idea of objective beauty and objective aesthetics. And so this goes back to Plato, the good, the true, and the beautiful. But certainly, I think I think Christianity would certainly agree with that framing, the good, the true, and the beautiful, all of which are tied to order, the good tied to moral order, the true tied to truth, logic, all this stuff, order, and then the beautiful, again, tied to order. I mean, when we look at, for example, beauty in women or men, it has to do with symmetry. It has to do with correct geometry, and that innately we recognize this, and so we see objective understandings. You may have different preferences, you may, like this versus that, but we all recognize when something is amazingly symmetrical and geometric that it is beautiful, that it induces a sort of aesthetic pleasure within us to witness that, to see that. So that I believe to be a fact, that beauty is actually objective. Aesthetics are objective. And in my mind, then the movement, the modern movement, the second half of the 20th century movement to abstract art, what we would even talk about as modern art, is a doing away with that objective understanding of aesthetics and beauty, and a movement towards a sort of subjective reinterpretation of something abstract, and which leads to epistemological understandings of relativism and subjective truth, right? Because if the art, it doesn't have a sort of objective component to an objective dimension of beauty, of aesthetics, and instead it's just this abstract display which can be subjectively interpreted in a million different ways, you see how that is then slowly but surely going to be tied to philosophical understandings of epistemology, which again we see that whole movement in the 20th century towards now we live in a post-truth society. Everything is relative. Everything is subjective. And so I think that's even tied to modern trends and what I describe as scarification. Scarification, the tattooing of oneself, the immensity of piercings we're seeing, the whole septum, the cattle piercing that girls have, facial tattoos, dyed colors in your hair. I think all this stuff is actually a response against. It's in the same line of movement as the abstract artistic tradition, in being in opposition to objective traditional understandings of beauty. And so I see modern culture as almost bifurcating between objective appreciation of beauty and the sort of subjective opposition to traditional forms of beauty in celebration of abstract, subjective understandings of truth and beauty, and then the scarification of oneself as being beautiful. So trans, dyed hair, all the piercings, all the tattoos. To me, all this stuff actually is not beautiful. It's the opposite of beauty in my mind. And I know that could be interpreted as subjective, but I actually don't believe it to be subjective. I think this is an objective. I think this is objective. I think that beauty itself, symmetry itself, somebody representing God's creation to the fullest ability. And this would be just individuals. So individual, male, female, representing what that is to its fullest capability, I think is objectively beautiful. That means a woman or man being fit, being masculine, being feminine in the traditional ways, I think is objectively beautiful. And that's really, that undercurrent is what our society is in opposition to. And you see this even with like the Barack Obama library being asymmetrical, right? You see this in modern architecture to be asymmetrical or to simplify. So, they're not as interested in ornateness in modern architecture. It's about simplicity. And then on the other side of that, you have like the modern simplicity movement, and then you have the asymmetrical kind of abstract architecture, which you see in like Barack Obama's library, where I believe there is nothing that is symmetrical. And to me, again, this is a larger presupposition. This is a larger undercurrent of people's approach to reality. And then the third thing is, now rooting all this within Logos, is that Logos provides us with an immense metaphysics to account for fractals and sacred geometry. And so we have Logos theology, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of the Father, which is totally transcendent and shares its essence, the Father's, with the three persons. So it's the Father, and then it shares its essence with the Son and the Holy Spirit, all of which then share in the being of God, but three different persons. Our second person, the Logos, is composed of logoi. You've heard me talk about this multiple times. And the logoi are things such as logic, again, order. Order itself is a logoi. Love, which is another pattern of order, right? Love has boundaries. And so boundary itself is now like a bad word. differentiation is a sort of bad word now in modern society, which again, I'm tying to everything I just said in regards to scarification, subjective truth, abstract art. It's these larger undercurrents and presuppositions that I think are happening. So to even have differentiation between male and female, differentiation between cultures, differentiation between better or worse cultures, this stuff these are basically no-go zones, because I think the real goal of evil, the real goal of what's happening in the modern world is to make everything equal, because therefore truth is equal to falsity, and then evil is equal to good, and you really can't make any distinction between the two. I think this is really, because for me, reality is framed in a spiritual war. I think this is really what's happening. But Logos theology, we have, again, love has boundaries. Logic clearly has boundaries. We have laws of logic, logical fallacies. Truth has boundaries. Truth is another logoi of the Logos. And, honor has boundaries. What exactly are you honoring if there isn't, to honor something implies a sort of hard work, a sort of dedication, a sort of all these things that we consider good, and that's then maybe you're an incredible general or a leader, political figure, or an athlete, or an academic, or an intellectual. Then you are honored based on all those things which we perceive to be good. Again, all of which is rooted within the Logos. So that would also include justice. I mean, justice clearly has boundaries. It has to differentiate from the just and the unjust, again, rooted in the Logos. And so order itself, these fractals, sacred geometric structures. Well, numbers, remember in my video on synchronicity and divine providence, Jung used to say that numbers are the archetypes of order. Okay, we can get to that to a degree, but we would say Logos is where the source of all archetypes, and numbers are rooted within the Logos. So numbers itself, language itself, symbolic, the use of symbolism, which includes numbers, letters, words, language, all that stuff. It's all rooted within the Logos. Language itself is an ordered process that has distinctions and differentiations. And so what I'm trying to really hint at here is when you look at Logos and Logos theology, I feel the whole ordering principle, the whole differentiation principle that really the Logos is engulfing is what our modern society is in opposition to. And so I also, in regards to Christianity and Logos theology as opposed to Islam, this is actually a bit complicated, but Islam is like Catholicism in its understanding of Allah being a form of absolute divine simplicity, therefore collapsing the energy essence distinction, therefore falling into philosophical problems in relating creation to the Creator, because now the two are becoming to be synonymous. And this is also the problem that the Thomists fall into in Catholicism, and then, of course, the Protestants emerge from, continuing that same intellectual baggage. But the Logos gives us an entire metaphysics for all this stuff, and I think there's just been a continual moving away from that. And that was the point of this video, is really to highlight how things that we find in the New Age spirituality, which I think has truthful components like sacred geometry and fractals representing a sort of divine principle within the universe, that is true. But then if you ask them to provide a metaphysics for that, they can't. Whereas the point of this video is to show that we can with Logos, that Logos can provide a metaphysics for all the things that people find most lovely and idyllic about the whole New Age worldview, the whole spiritual, not religious, the whole visionary psychedelic culture, that we actually have a metaphysics, we actually have a coherent worldview from beginning to end that can encapsulate all those things, whereas they cannot. And so I want to end by saying we are not then talking about a Masonic God, a architect, right? Which I did want to highlight that the kind of Masonic understanding of God as being the architect of the universe, the architect of creation, is rooted in the idea of divine simplicity, absolute divine simplicity, and therefore no coincidence in my mind we find Masonry coming out of Western Europe, coming out of Catholic and Protestant culture, and tied with, then you have like the Shriners, Islamic Masonry, both of which, like I just mentioned, Islam and Catholicism have this kind of doctrine of absolute divine simplicity. So I don't think it's any coincidence that both of them kind of revert back to Masonic traditions, which then re-understand God as the architect, which then ties God to being synonymous with creation, which then causes a lot of philosophical problems, whereas we as Orthodox, Logos is responsible for all creation. The Father is totally transcendent beyond. We do not fall victim to these dialectics. We do not fall victim to the problem of God being equated with creation, because for us, the second person is sort of equated with creation in one form of its hypostasis. So one form of its hypostasis is God. The other form is that it created the world and it became the world by incarnating it to a degree. So that is the uniqueness of the second person, and we still have the Father, which is totally transcendent, which totally prevents us from a logical standpoint to fall victim to the same philosophical problems you'd find in Islam and Catholicism, which, like I was mentioning, I don't think it's a coincidence that then Masonry comes out of those two societies. Even though Shrinery, Islamic Masonry, it's certainly tied to Western developments. I understand, but you see what I'm trying to say, and why does Orthodox countries not fall victim to Masonry? Why can you not be a Mason and be an Orthodox Christian? Well, it's tied to these ideas. And so geometry, I wanted to also point out, is not limited to architecture. It's not limited to shapes and balance. It's also, balance is right, but it's also related to music. Music is geometric. Harmony is geometric. And so another dimension of the whole New Age, spiritual, not religious, is, everything's a vibration, man. Like you're killing my vibes. You got bad vibes. Well, vibrations, where does that idea come from? And we can see sacred geometry, fractals, sacred shapes in something like cymatics. So those of you who are familiar, cymatics is the science of how sound creates shape. So I highly recommend those of you who are not familiar with anything that I'm saying right now in regards to cymatics, cymatics, cymatics. You can see videos on YouTube of people putting sand on kind of cymatic machines, these sort of speakers, and then playing a frequency, and then the sand organizing itself into a shape, into a sacred geometric shape. That is a sort of, to me, again, symbolizing a sort of innate patternistic order within the world, and how sound is related to this. Well, for our Christian understanding, God differentiated the world, created order out of chaos through His Word, through His Logos, which, if He's speaking it into existence, and implies a sort of vibratory relationship, right? That words themselves, language itself, vibration themselves sort of organize the world. And I just think that, again, we could begin to provide a whole metaphysics for that understanding. Not that we would buy wholesale the whole New Age vibration, all this stuff. That's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying we can take that concept of vibration, we can take the understanding of cymatics, the science of sound and shapes, and we have a whole worldview where that fits really nicely, just like I was trying to point out with synchronicity, just like I'm trying to point out right now with fractals and sacred geometry. And so, I've already mentioned, sacred geometry induces sacred spaces. That's why, throughout the world religions, we find sacred geometry used for the construction of temples, mosques, cathedrals, churches, stuff like that, because we understand that sacred geometry induces sacred space. It's objectively beautiful, it's objectively aesthetically pleasing, and therefore you create these structures in which to worship God, or to worship whatever you connote as the divine, and then you can get into whole theological disputes of that understanding. But Logos theology, like I said, it's morality. Our moral order is tied to fractals and sacred geometry. So one of the things that I was trying to point out in the video on synchronicity and divine providence is how your choices, synchronistic events themselves, are sort of sacred geometric fractal patterns in time that are self-similar in meaning, right? They're kind of self-similar in scale, and that morality, once you begin to live your life in the moral way, so from the Orthodox Christian perspective, you will begin to cleanse your nous. You'll be able to interpret the world better. You'll be able to understand God's messages better. Be able to recognize truth better because your nous is clear, and the nous allows you to participate with the divine mind called the Logos. So, but all these things are order. Morality and living your life in a moral way creates a sort of harmony in which doing that thing in the most immediate moment, right? Because this is what we were talking about with the synchronicity, is to not focus, as Christians, we shouldn't be focusing so much, not that we don't, so much on the future or the past in terms of what we did or didn't do or what we should do. But in the immediate moment, right, Jesus talks about providing for the birds in the air and how, to not worry about tomorrow or yesterday, but right now, and that there has to be something right now you can do that's the right moral decision, the right move. Whether that's, okay, well, you need to stop consuming entertainment and start working on what you need to work on. I know that's not necessarily moral, but you see how that's a movement towards the correct ordering, like that's movement towards the Logos, more movement towards responsibility, I guess, if you will, which again is responsibility to sort of order. So without Logos, then it all crumbles. What I believe these other religious institutions are trying to do with the use of sacred geometry and the erection of these sacred spaces, these sacred structures, is really to represent Logos, and that we have, as Orthodox Christianity, and this is just my opinion, so you can disagree or leave refutations against what I'm speaking about, but we have the correct theology. Logos accounts for what they're trying to do, and without Logos, everything crumbles. You have no cohesion, you have no unity, because, like I said, Logos is order. It's the moral order. It's the order of truth. It's the logical order. It's the sacred geometric order. It's the fractal order. It's the order of justice, of honor, of glory, of parental order. Honoring your mother and your father is a sort of ordering process. It's a sort of fractal pattern, because eventually you will become the parent, you will have your children, and that same reciprocal feedback loop will still be true, to honor your mother and your father. So sorry, I've been all over the place in this video. I have I have a bunch of things written down, and then I just start going. So with that being said, let me know what you guys think. That really concludes my video. I'm sure there's things that I said that I didn't say. This is not an exhaustive analysis of Logos, fractals, and sacred geometry. This is just me sitting down, writing out my ideas, looking stuff up online, and then kind of constructing what I was trying to demonstrate today, what hopefully I did for some of you, was that Logos theology allows us to provide a metaphysics and a whole coherent worldview around fractal mathematics and sacred geometry as being sacred. And that if you're in a sort of spiritual, not religious, a new age paradigm, or in my opinion, you could even go further and say an Islamic or a Hindu or a Buddhist, you can't really account for order in the same way. You don't have an immense metaphysics to account for that, where you do in Logos theology. And so I think this is another way in which we as Christians can bring people within those other paradigms to Christ by showing that you don't have to give up any of that stuff. You don't have to give up, the kind of awe factor induced by fractals or sacred geometry, because, somebody's trying to tell you about the gospel or Christianity or Jesus. In fact, we have a whole worldview that accounts for that. You're going to find way more harmony and our understanding of fractals and sacred geometry than you're going to find in your own worldview, in your own paradigm. So that was the point of this video, is just to show how fractals and sacred geometry are rooted within Logos theology, and why Logos theology actually provides a metaphysics for those things. So with that being said, that's the end of the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Please like, share, and subscribe this video. Again, thank you guys so much for all the love and support. I truly, truly appreciate it. I have more videos that I'll be posting this week. This is going to be, so this is Sunday. I plan on doing a Gnostic video on the wisdom of Jesus Christ, a Gnostic text called the Wisdom of Jesus Christ. I plan on making a video on that. And I have a whole kind of mind full of video topics, none of which I've done anything to start organizing or work towards. But if you have some topics that you'd like to see in 2020, put them in the comment section so I can start to write them down and start organizing and curating some information for videos in the future. So let me know what you guys think. Did you like this video? Did you hate this video? Did it make sense to you? Am I kind of beating a dead horse? A lot of these topics I've mentioned in previous videos, but I thought it'd be important to grab all those ideas and then put them in one single video that people could watch. So let me know what you guys think. Again, love you guys, and until Tuesday, until next time, as always, God bless.